Well, even before you heard today's readings, there's a lot to be afraid of, isn't there? I mean, there's the planet, first of all. Will we, as a species, take the measures required to turn global warming around in time to keep this place habitable? There are those wars, the one in Ukraine and the one between Israelis and Hamas, and we not only grieve at the horrors we hear about it, it might occur to us that World War III is not as unthinkable as we used to think it was. Then there's domestic politics. The dysfunction on Capitol Hill and in Madison, anxieties about next year's presidential election, neo-Nazis demonstrating in Wisconsin. There is our own city, gun violence and reckless driving, in the sense that there are way too many lives that don't seem to matter. And we have our own congregational things to worry about. How best to equip ourselves for our future. And I know that for many of us there are personal things. The diagnosis you're waiting for, the child or grandchild whose transition to adulthood is rocky, the issues that might be coming up between you and who you thought would be your life partner. There's a lot of fear in the psalm this morning. There, when you first read it, it seems to be about time, about how short a time we have, the time of a human life. The psalmist is speaking for a community that is longing to be rescued from whatever the problem is that they're dealing with. It might be foreigners, it might be bad crops, it might be a public health emergency. But it sounds like it has been going on for a long time, when the psalmist seems to feel the need to remind God of the difference in their perspectives. Look, I know for you, 1,000 years is like a single day. But us mortals, we live maybe 70 years, 80 if we're strong. If you don't save us soon, it'll be too late. It's phrased as though the psalmist is afraid God doesn't realize the urgency of the situation, but I think really it's anxiety that the psalmist doesn't know what to expect. There's just too much unknown to be afraid of, and death, the biggest unknown of all. And then there's the gospel reading. Those poor guys, entrusted with the master's property, not knowing how long he'll be gone, but anxious about being ready for his return, making shrewd choices or cowardly ones. If we have faced up to our own fears, maybe we can understand the third slave, the one who was afraid, the one who didn't want the responsibility of caring for the boss's property, the one who buried the money in the ground to safeguard it. And maybe we can imagine his relief when the boss comes back home, when he could dig up the money, hand it over, and say, "Here is what belongs to you." And maybe we cringe at the injustice of the boss's response, being called bad and lazy, and then being thrown out into that outer darkness that Matthew likes to talk about. But maybe we know, too, that there is something realistic about the description. When we live in fear, we can trap ourselves in that fear. Sometimes what we fear happens not because we were right to fear it, but because in fear we enabled it to happen. You don't trust your kids? They might live right down to your expectations. You're so afraid of missing your freeway exit that you get off too soon. But the parable is not only, or even mostly, about the ways we live in fear in our individual lives. It is also about the ways we live in fear as communities. We fear that we will not have enough resources to continue our ministries, and so we may find ourselves tempted to act in ways that cripple the very ministries we are afraid to lose. Bill Loader, an Australian interpreter, comments, if the modern use of talents has any relation to the text, it is and there's no clear sense that it does necessarily. A talent in the biblical text is a big chunk of money. But anyway, if the modern use of talents has any relation to the text, it is at the level of allowing God's life to do its adventures with us and putting our talents, our natural abilities, at God's disposal. The talents of the parable are really about divine life and power, not about our abilities. But the appropriate response is to allow God's investing hand to employ our abilities. The tragedy is that many people are afraid of losing or endangering God, and so seek to protect God from adventures, to resist attempts at radical inclusion that might, they fear, compromise God's purity and holiness. Protecting God is a variant of not trusting God. We need to encourage people to stop putting God under the mattress. As we begin to trust, allowing God to move through us, our lives change as individuals, and our communities have a better chance of change. Well, that was all Bill Loader. Now it's me. The gospel reading is not centrally about the stuff that we bury, but about the burying itself, the fear that keeps us closed in on ourselves. And that is one basic definition of sin, being curved in on oneself. One of the things that I have loved about being in this congregation is our tendency to curve outward rather than inward. I know I keep pointing every chance I have to Interchange Food Pantry and Power Shift and hosting the International Institute. But when I listen to the history of this congregation, things like the Adult Daycare Center, I realize that this congregation has always had a heart for community outreach, for spending ourselves in service to those who would benefit from an embodied expression of God's love for them. This is one of the things I have loved about Pastor Donna's ministry among us. Not only her heart for outreach, but also her imagination that keeps finding ways for us to engage with the community in which we worship and which we wish to welcome into ourselves. It is not as easy as it used to be for people not to know that there's a church on this corner. Sometimes it still happens. But more often, it seems to me, in recent Power Shift, it's not, oh, there's a church here, but what's the church doing being open this time of night? And the surprise, sometimes disbelief, when they hear, we're here for you. This is our question, I think, as we try to imagine and enable Village Church's future. How do we keep from curving in on ourselves? How do we keep turning outward toward those who do not know that they are loved, they are valued, that their lives and their well-being matter? How can we continue to be a place with a heart for community outreach, empowered by imagination that keeps seeking new ways to embody God's love in this world? And I think one of the reasons to gather in this space on Sunday mornings is to equip ourselves for the ministries in which we will engage throughout the week. Whether it's things we do in the name of Village Church or simply in daily interactions with people, at work, at a coffee shop or a supermarket, at the family breakfast table. Here, we equip ourselves to walk right through the fear and find that it's the risking of ourselves that brings our well-being. God grant us the courage to make it so. Amen.